Inverclyde wasn't always so busy. In the beginning, there were no cars, there were no streets, there were no people, there was only land. It all started with a church. In the late 12th century, the monks of Paisley Abbey were granted the penny land between the rivulets of Kip and Daff to cultivate and populate. By 1188, they had built the old kirk, and sure enough, people came from as far afield as Kilmacolm and Largs to worship at this place they come to know as Inner Kip. Over the following years, the geology of the area changed little, but people persevered, farming the land and fishing the waters best they could. Their persistence was rewarded as both provided well for the families who chose to settle. By 1306, Inverkip was being used in the war against Scottish independence as a launch and supply point for the English troops. That was until King Robert I, also known as Robert the Bruce, laid siege to the town, reclaiming Ardgowan Castle. In recognition of James Lindsay's loyalty during this time, Robert the Bruce's son, King Robert II, granted the nearby lands of Dunrod to Lindsay's grandson, John de Lindsay, in 1382. Living in their castle high on Dunrod Hill, the Lindsays would become synonymous with cruelty and eccentricity, remembered for all the wrong reasons. After the king's unexpected death, his son John Stuart, Earl of Carrick, ascended to the throne to become King Robert III, and soon after granted his own biological son, also named John Stuart, the nearby estates of Ardgowan. The fishing industry was prospering, and a new church was to be built for the increased population, who were still having to travel to Inverkip. It was to be built on Greenock's west shore, lending to its name the West Kirk, although it was affectionately known by the parishioners as the Sailor's Kirk. Archibald Stuart expands his estates in 1619 by purchasing the neighbouring land from the eccentric and impoverished Alexander Lindsay, last of the Dunrods. And soon after, John Shaw obtained a charter from King Charles I to grant Greenock the right of a borough, and so began the modern development of the area. But these would prove of little comfort to the residents, as the reign of fear and mystery did not die with all Dunrod, and witch trials were to continue for nearly 100 years more. One that seems to have left an impression in the community is that of young Mary Lamont, who, in 1662, confessed to her crimes and was sentenced to death. During her trial, she admitted to being part of a conspiracy to push a local stone into the river. Mary's intention had been to disrupt shipping on the river, as the ominous Kemphook stone, known locally as Granny Kemphook, was considered to be a talisman to local sailors. While rural life continued to be oppressed, ruled by fear and superstition, urban society was evolving, and the nearby towns were developing thanks to the growth of the fishing industry. When the Town Council of Glasgow recognised the need for a deep water port, Newark was the natural choice, as the river began to get shallower from this point inland. They purchased the surrounding land for use as a harbour, and the town of Newark soon became known as Port Glasgow. It was clearly a time for advancement and innovation. An abundance of fish were being brought ashore every day, and with more caught than could be consumed, Glasgow merchant and provost Walter Gibson was inspired to devise a method of preservation and curing for export. In 1688, the very first herring was smoked in Great Britain, behind the old corner house on the left of the quayhead. By 1693, civilization was evolving at an astounding rate, and Port Glasgow was no different. The streets were to be fashioned using the grid system on which Edinburgh and Glasgow had already been remodelled, mimicking the bigger cities in Europe. Gourock was soon to follow suit, a charter being obtained in 1694 to incorporate the lands of Gourock into a borough, with power to rear, build and enlarge. It wasn't long before the Board of Customs and Excise exerted a local presence, the harbour having been constructed for trade traffic in and out of Glasgow, and in 1707 an office was established in Greenock. Although it is said that much of the custom officers' time was spent chasing smugglers operating off the shores of Inverkip. Barely a decade into the 18th century, and the primary industry in the area, fishing, had flourished so much that others began to rise up in support, the most obvious being the requirement of a boat. And by 1711, Scots had set up shop and built their first herring bus. This would be the first of many, and the beginning of an industry that would sustain the area for more than a quarter of a millennium. This new industry attracted many migrants, many of which were crofters forced from their homes during the Highland clearances to seek employment elsewhere. One such immigrant was Robert Campbell. Originally from Campbelltown, he obtained work in Scots shipyards as an apprentice carpenter. Robert would be better remembered as brother of Mary Campbell, also known as Highland Mary, the love of Robert Burns. Mary passed in 1786 after contracting a fever while nursing her brother. Although the location of her passing is one of much debate, the consensus is that she drew her last breath in Minns Collop Close off William Street. In 1736, Sir John Shaw's granddaughter, Eleanor Houston, married Sir Michael Stuart, greatly enriching their family and leading to the building of her Gown House. The Shaw-Stuart legacy is born, their joint estates encompassing most of Greenock and the surrounding area. The more people that passed through, coming into port from further afield, the more that the industry began to diversify. The first sugar house, located at the bottom of the long-gone Sugar House Lane, was built by German immigrant Mark Kuhl in 1765.
Mark Kuhl developed sugar refining. Germans were described as being masters of sugar baking. As far as we know, it was pretty bad work, really difficult and quite dangerous. So essentially the sugar refineries were often mostly full of Germans and Irish workers as well.
Born of necessity, the roadworks were set up in Gourock in 1777, filling the demands of both fishing and shipbuilding industries. The growing economy saw more money in the pockets of the workers, and many sought to protect their earnings or save for their family's future. The Greenock Banking Company was established on the 25th of July 1785 in a tenement on the north side of Hamilton Street. The bank later moved to the bank buildings on Lindsay's Lane. The extreme regularity of the bank's movements were apparently infamous, as it was the focus of a robbery by London thieves on the 9th of March 1828. 1817. With much of the population's drinking water being drawn from the now polluted Clyde, typhus and cholera epidemics were becoming more common, but improvements to living and working conditions were underway, not least of which was the supply of fresh water, both for consumption and to supply power to mills. In 1825, esteemed engineer Robert Thom undertook the task of building a reservoir that would do just this. By 1827, the aqueduct was opened, drawing water from a reservoir below Loch Tom and running towards the town, hugging the contours of the hill for 5 miles and collecting water from the numerous streams and balancing reservoirs along the way. It would feed a pair of continuous mill lathes from which companies such as the sugar refineries, ropeworks and mills for flour, paper and wool could rent individual falls to run their wheels. Each of these factories, built on 19 levels down the hillside, were guaranteed a water supply 12 hours per day, 310 days per year. Thanks to the aqueduct, the town now had fresh, clean drinking water for the first time, but the system's priorities remained to industry. Automation was the key to success, and more power. When the first gasworks was constructed in the Glebe in 1828, the possibilities seemed endless. By the time the second larger plant was erected in Inchgreen on the east of town in 1872, the mill wheels had already begun to be replaced by turbines. But the subsequent increase in production encouraged an increase in population, and poor sanitation encouraged epidemic. By 1834, much of the population had the Gaelic, and after being told that the use of their language would be dispensed with during service, they took steps, forming a society to protect their traditions and secure an appropriate education for their children. The following year, in 1835, the foundation stone was laid for the Highlanders Academy. In 1840, the Caledonia Railway was opened, and Inverkip was no longer a farming community as tourists began flooding their streets. It was now a resort where workers from the towns would spend their days off doing the water. Between the years of 1845 and 1852, the blight of the Irish potato famine saw an estimated inflow of Irish immigrants up the Clyde of 1,000 per week, increasing population by 90%. And within the next few years, it's estimated that between a half and 3/4 of all dock workers are Irish, as are nearly half of the female textile workers. Paddy on the Railway, a broadsheet ballad published in the 1800s, tells the story of an immigrant's travels in search of work, and was fairly typical of the thousands of migrant workers who travelled from Ireland to Scotland in search of employment, particularly throughout the 19th century.
In Greenock town, for Glasgow City he was bound, staring all round and round. At length he saw the railway.
With a third of the population dying from the latest outbreak of cholera, and crops failing on the local farms at Inverkip, the blame falls upon the Irish, and tension in the community increases. Further fuelled by their lowly occupational status and willingness to work for less than the going rate, it was not uncommon for the Irish to be attacked in the newspapers, from pulpits or even in the street. In 1850, Greenock opened its first poorhouse in Captain Street, with an adjacent parochial lunatic asylum. This was clearly the beginning of a more benevolent time, as the following year the Greenock Medical Association was established, bringing further relief to those in need. This improvement to the health system was long overdue, as typhus was once again rearing its ugly head, leaving multiple fatalities in its wake throughout the three boroughs. Irish-born priest Father Michael Condon is appointed to take charge of St Lawrence's parish in 1859. Becoming sympathetic to the plight of other Irish immigrants, he undertakes a duty of care, recording detailed accounts of their hardships in his journals. Hundreds of poor creatures from Ireland and other parts of the country arrive penniless and homeless in quest of work, and an epidemic of typhoid fever, smallpox of a malignant type, rages in the town so small that the managing committee of the infirmary have now considered the propriety of erecting large sheds for the accommodation of sufferers' cases. In the following years, Father Condon works closely with Dr. William Joseph McCloskey, one of the 5 medical martyrs, opening a reading room for Irish Catholics. The medical martyrs received their posthumous title and a page in the British Medical Journal under the heading Fever in Greenock after the harsh winter of 1864-1865. In November 1864, 5 healthy young doctors in their 20s and 30s, a third of the local profession at the time, went out into the community to treat the sick, and by the following March they would all be dead. The sanitation situation improves when the town council purchases Shaw's Water Company, regularly cleaning the open duct, reducing blockages in winter and repairing damage from deterioration. By 1876, the Captain Street Poorhouse is in such a state of decay that work was underway in a new institution, the Smithton Poorhouse in Inverkip Road. Neil Fleming and Reed's Spinning Works replaces its wheel with a turbine in 1881. One of the last to do so, the infamous 70-foot wheel was immense, weighing 180 tonnes and driving more than 34,000 individual spindles. As Lithuanian and Polish immigration increases in the late 1890s, the introduction of the Alien Act halts immigration into Britain, but not within the borders. In 1908, the Admiralty announced that they would be constructing a new torpedo factory in Greenock, on the shore of the River Clyde. The location was chosen as it was directly opposite Loch Long, where they planned on testing their product. It was considered ideal due to its sheltered position, great depth of water, and comparative freedom from traffic. The fact that the land was owned by Sir Hugh Shaw Stewart, who had desired to keep the West End free of industrial development, did not deter the Admiralty, who informed him in no uncertain terms that they could take his land compulsorily through an Act of Parliament. He was assured, however, that their presence would neither be dangerous nor become in any way a nuisance to the inhabitants. By 1910, when the plant officially opened, 700 workers and their families had arrived from Woolwich to oversee the running of the operation.
Woolwich's loss is to be Greenock's gain, as hordes of workers have already started arriving per Caledonian Railway, many of the families having already secured housing in the central part of town. The building of the £60,000 torpedo factory has been contracted to Mercer's, Robert Neal & Co., from Manchester, and will cover 10 acres. Local labour is to be employed using machinery driven by electricity from the Greenock Corporation. The Evening Express reported that the factory would employ 400 men, although 600 jobs would be lost at Woolwich due to the removal of the plant. These men were told that they would receive preference for employment at the new works. Most were adverse to the imminent change. One told the Express that he lived in Woolwich.
Many local builders took advantage of the arrivals and viewed land round the factory to create accommodation for the workers and their families. The subsequent years saw a massive population increase in Greenock, overwhelming the level of available accommodation. The desperation of the immigrants could be read in the Greenock Telegraph's reports of Sassenach audacity, basically families utilising any occupied homes in order to store their furniture. Clearly there was a need for additional housing, and in 1914 a complaint was heard by the local government that adequate measures had not been taken to home the imported workforce. Appalled at what was considered acceptable housing in Scotland, the Woolwich immigrants wrote to express their dissatisfaction at the lack of consideration for their English ideals. In their opinion, the Scotch homes lacked natural light and private grounds, and the bedrooms were too small, although they did concur that the reception rooms were larger in Scotland. There were also sublets available for those without families, although many chose to settle, marrying locals and laying down roots. Richard Clifford arrived in Greenock in 1910. residing in Fort Matilda with other unmarried torpedo factory workers like himself. The following year he met his wife-to-be, Marion Ferguson. They married on the 8th of September 1911 and the children soon followed. It wasn't long before news travelled of the employment opportunities available at the new factory, and soon many other immigrants began to arrive looking for work. This influx of newcomers, known locally as English invaders and Sassenachs, invoked a wave of xenophobia among the locals, breeding curiosity and suspicion. This reaction, adopted by many of the locals, forced the ostracised outsiders to form their own community in order to ease the transition, and the Torpedo Factory Club was born.
I was a torpedoman in the Navy.
All right,
And through that, I'd been through a torpedo factory and everything. Through that, we come down here as in guests, and they give us a temporary membership then.
Following Britain's entry into the First World War, all British civilians in Germany were detained for the duration of the conflict. But the same happened here. German immigrants, mostly women, were forced to appear in front of an internment board, who would subsequently decide whether they were to be considered a threat to the community. Most were deemed friendly, since their sons were fighting for the crown. With shipbuilding now the primary industry, the yards were taking over the coastline, removing any obstacles in their way. Harland and Wolff, builders of the Titanic and the proud new owners of Cairns Shipyard, made a proposition to the Greenock Presbytery. They offered to purchase but provide another suitable site to which the West Kirk Church and the churchyard could be with all care and reverence transferred. After much negotiation, agreement was reached among the parties involved in the relocation of the Old Kirk, whereby Harland and Wolff would pay for dismantling of the church and the building of its replica at Seafield on the Esplanade. The old West Kirk closes and the momentous task of dismantling the ancient historic church begins. Built on the west shore in 1591 by John Shaw, it was now to be rebuilt a short distance away on another shore, with almost the same view across the River Clyde to the Argyllshire hills and bens. That it should be within sight of passing ships was fitting, for it had long been known as the Sailors' Kirk. The old stones were dismantled, numbered, transported, cleaned and rebuilt on their new site on the Esplanade. Strange carvings were found on the underside of many stones. Birds, fish, animals, dates and initials hidden for over 300 years when, in 1589, work had begun on the first West Kirk. A less pleasant task was the clearing out of the ancient cemetery, first used in 1592 and closed in 1857. The rebuilding of the church had begun in March 1926 and was completed 2 years later in January 1928.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now.
September 1st, 1939, Britain declares war in Germany and enters World War II.
This country is at war with Germany.
When Mussolini joined the Axis and declared war against the Allies in June 1940, the backlash against the Italian community echoed throughout Inverclyde. Once again, men were taken from their homes in the middle of the night and sent to internment camps, the remaining families being turned upon by those once regarded as friends. Businesses were attacked and looted, homes were destroyed, and the community was torn apart.
We were very fortunate, for argument's sake. During the war, our windows didn't get broken here. We were fortunate enough there were 2 soldiers that lived across the road who protected us. Yet I know of cafes in Greenock and Port Glasgow where the windows were all pushed in.
When the war broke out, the shop was ransacked. I think that my father, I'm sure he told me that the family were upstairs above the shop and they could hear it being smashed. And but a lot of the regular customers who used to come in didn't want to be party to that, and I think they helped clear up and things. So although there were people who obviously reacted one way, I don't think it wasn't as clear cut that everybody was like that.
It was a natural reaction because obviously Italy had gone into the war with Germany. Internment was necessary. Whether you liked it or not, you had to understand it. And I think most of the people that ended up in the Isle of Man felt that way.
The police turned up at the door and gave him 20 minutes to pack a bag. His father to pack a bag, and he was taken away and put in a prisoner of war camp in the Isle of Man. And when he was in the prisoner of war camp, they were allowed to go and visit, I think, I could be wrong about this, but I think it was like they got one visit allowed once every 3 months or something. Or it might have been more than that, once every 6 months, something like that. But I don't think they could afford to go and see them that often. And the strange thing about my grandfather being thrown in a prisoner of war camp because he was obviously seen as an undesirable alien was that my father was called up to do British National Service. So they threw his father in a prisoner of war camp and then called my father up to do National Service to defend Britain, do you know what I mean?
And did he?
Yeah, he did.
So some went to the Isle of Man, were lucky, and they were on this ship going to Canada, and it was torpedoed beside Ireland. My uncle was lucky,
he was on the Endora Star.
But he was young and Chima was his second name. So they brought them back to Greenock.
The ones that were saved.
They were saved, they brought back to get, and then they put them on another ship for Australia.
Did he ever tell you the story about the torpedo and the Endora Star?
He did.
First hand?
He did actually, yeah. You see, there was a lot of older men on it, and they were fat and had never seen the water. So they couldn't swim, so they just died. But he was young and he was strong and a good swimmer, so he was saved. But imagine all those hours in the sea, you know.
Who saved them?
And then some ships, passing ships.
Well, we're near Ireland.
They were near Ireland. But there was Germans on it as well. And it had a cross on it, a red cross. That the Germans torpedoed
The
it.
sighting of the Endora Star, do you think that was a devastating turn for the Italian community?
It was, yeah. Because a lot of them lost their husbands, their sons. It was really bad.
Quite a few of the local Italians were on board in that. So there's a big chunk of Italian communities died out in the Atlantic. They overcalculated the amount of people to go on the boat, and they took a batch off. And my uncle happened to be one of the batch that came off. But his cousins went on it, and they perished in it. In fact, if my father hadn't been classified as high risk, he could have been on that boat to Canada as well. But he was high risk, so he was Berlini Sochten on the Isle of Man. It wasn't a case he had any choice.
Then the attack came. In the small hours of the morning, while most of the town slept, the Nazi German Luftwaffe attacked. It's ironic to think that an industry which supported an area could also endanger or destroy the same community which had created it. But the 50 bombers dropping shells along the coast of the Clyde were targeting the shipbuilding industry and the people who had worked so hard to build it. People scurried for cover, some ran for the protection of the surrounding hills, but most took refuge in local air raid shelters. The area suffered greatly, bearing many casualties, fatalities and much damage to property. Air raid sirens at 12:15 AM the following morning signalled a second onslaught. This time the Luftwaffe began dropping incendiary bombs on the perimeter of the town, setting the Ingliston Street distillery alight with a direct hit. The ensuing inferno acted as a beacon, guiding the second wave of aircraft toward their targets. The final attack occurred around 2 AM and involved high explosive bombs and parachute landmines, creating widespread destruction. It is thought that the casualty list would have been higher were it not for the deceptive genius of the Air Ministry, who lit a decoy on the hill beyond the town. The facade was situated out past Loch Tom, laid out to simulate a burning urban area. It worked effectively, drawing enemy fire and satisfying their appetite for destruction. At 3:30 AM, the all clear sounded, but the entire town appeared to be in flames. The town's rebuilt after the war, but the scars remain on the community, both physical and emotional.